Arthur no longer repaired music boxes. He had stopped 2 winters ago, not long after Mary Ann's death. Customers still brought them sometimes, small lacquered boxes with dancing ballerinas or tiny silver combs hidden beneath velvet lids. But Arthur always refused politely. He told people the springs were too delicate for his old hands. But the truth was simpler than that. He could not bear melodies. That ended. For 47 years, he had shared his workshop with the soft rhythm of ticking clocks and the quiet hum of his wife's voice as she read aloud in the evenings. But Mary Ann had been gone for 3 winters now. And the sound of her voice had faded into the gentle, persistent memory that lived in the walls, in the floorboards, in the steady hands of every clock he had ever repaired. The second thing you must know is that the clockmaker believed in time the way other people believed in love, as something that could be held, understood, and occasionally, with great patience, fixed. His workshop sat at the end of a narrow cobblestone street in a village that tourists forgot existed after the first snow fell. The sign above the door read simply, "Horology and Repair." Below it, in smaller, faded letters, "Established 1932. During the day, pale winter light filtered through frosted windows, illuminating the hundreds of clocks that covered every surface. Grandfather clocks stood like sentinels in the corners. Pocket watches hung from hooks on the walls. Mantel clocks, carriage clocks, and delicate wristwatches covered the wooden workbench, each one in some stage of being brought back to life. The air smelled of brass polish and wood oil, and the faint, sweet scent of the tea he kept warm on a small electric burner in the corner. But it was the sound of the workshop that made it unlike any other place in the world. 1,000 soft ticks, each one slightly different from the next. A symphony of seconds, overlapping and interweaving, creating a current of time that flowed through the room like a river that never reached the sea. Some clocks chimed on the quarter hour. Others were silent, waiting for their turn to be restored. The grandfather clock by the door, the one his father had built by hand in the winter of 1926, kept the deepest, slowest rhythm of all. A steady, reassuring pulse that felt less like time passing and more like time breathing. The clockmaker himself was 73 years old. His hands were thin but steady. His eyes, behind wire-rimmed spectacles, were the color of winter rain. He wore the same brown wool vest every day, patched at the elbows by Marianne years ago, and he never worked in silence. Even when there was no music playing, the clocks provided their constant companionship. It was late December when the stranger arrived. The clockmaker was repairing a French mantel clock from the 1890s. A delicate thing with a cracked porcelain face and a mechanism that had been overwound by an impatient hand. Outside, snow had begun falling in the slow, drifting way that promised to continue through the night. The street lamps had just flickered on, casting pools of gold onto the white-covered cobblestones. The bell above the door chimed, a small, silvery sound that cut through the symphony of ticks. The clockmaker looked up from his work, his magnifying loupe still attached to his spectacles, making his right eye appear enormous and owlish. In the doorway stood a woman he did not recognize. She was perhaps 40 years old, wearing a heavy navy coat dusted with snow, a woolen scarf wrapped tightly around her throat, and an expression that the clockmaker had seen many times before. It was the expression of someone carrying something heavy, something that could not be put down. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you the clockmaker?" He removed the loop and set down his tweezers. "I am," he said. She stepped forward, and only then did he notice the small wooden box she held in both hands. It was not a new box. The wood was dark with age, and the corners were worn smooth. "My mother passed away last month," the woman said carefully, as though speaking the words too quickly might make the loss become real again. "I found this among her things. She never spoke of it. I don't know where it came from, but it's broken." She opened the box and set it gently on the workbench. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a pocket watch. It was unlike any the clockmaker had seen in his 47 years. The case was silver, intricately engraved with a pattern of intertwined ivy leaves, so fine that the work must have taken someone months to complete. The dial face was ivory, yellowed with age, with Roman numerals painted in a delicate, old-fashioned hand. The hands were frozen at 3:47. But it was the back of the watch that made the clockmaker's breath catch. Engraved on the silver in elegant script were two sets of initials, M, E, and J, T, and beneath them a date, October 14th, 1941. When did it stop? The clockmaker asked, his voice quieter than before. I don't know, the woman said. It was already stopped when I found it. Frozen. I tried winding it gently, but it won't move. I was told if anyone could fix it, it would be you. The clockmaker turned the watch over in his hands. It was warm, which was impossible. It had been carried through the snow. He held it to his ear. There was no sound, no tick, no whisper of a mechanism struggling to move. Just silence. I'll do what I can, he said. The woman nodded. Thank you. She paused at the door. I don't know your name. Arthur, he said. She nodded once more, and then she was gone. The door chimed again. The snow continued to fall. Arthur sat very still for a long time after the stranger left. The pocket watch lay on his workbench, small and silent and impossibly old. The initials glinted in the low light of his desk lamp. M, E, and J, T. A love, perhaps? A promise, certainly. A moment suspended in silver and ivory. Gently, with the care of a surgeon and the reverence of a man who understood that some objects carried more than their own weight. Arthur picked up his smallest screwdriver and began to open the watch. What he found inside made him stop. The mechanism was, at first glance, perfectly intact. The mainspring was not broken. The gears were not stripped. There was no rust, no corrosion, no obvious reason why the watch had ceased to function entirely. But then Arthur saw it. Beneath the barrel bridge, wedged between two brass gears so delicately that it was almost invisible, was something that did not belong there. a small piece of paper, folded many times, so thin that it had become translucent with age. It had been placed inside the watch deliberately. Arthur removed it with tweezers finer than a hair. He unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile paper. Inside, written in handwriting that matched the engraving on the back of the watch, were two short sentences. "Wait for me. I will come back. JT, October 14th, 1941. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. He thought of Mary Ann. He thought of all the promises the world had made and broken. He thought of the weight of a single sentence. Carried inside a watch for more than 80 years. He did not sleep that night. He cleaned every gear. He oiled every pivot. He worked more slowly and more carefully than he had ever worked in his life. The snow fell against the windows. The clocks ticked around him, and the pocket watch lay open on his bench, waiting. At 2:47 a.m., not 3:47, not yet, Arthur inserted the mainspring and gave it the gentlest of winds. The watch did not move. He frowned. He checked the gear train. Nothing was misaligned. He checked the escapement. It was perfect. He checked the balance wheel. It was whole and true. Its hairspring coiled with precision. And yet, the hands remained frozen at 3:47. Another hour passed. Arthur tried again, and again. At 3:41 a.m., Arthur sat back in his chair, exhausted. He looked at the watch. He thought about JT, whoever he was. He thought about M.E., whoever she was. He thought about a promise made in a world on the edge of darkness. And without knowing why, he closed his eyes and whispered the words written on the paper. "Wait for me. I will come back." He opened his eyes. The second hand trembled, then moved. One small impossible step forward. Tick. 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 Arthur lifted the watch slowly to his ear, and what he heard was not merely the sound of gears returning to life. beneath the ticking, delicate as memory itself, was the faintest suggestion of melody. Soft, distant, fragile enough to disappear if listened to too closely. Something inside Arthur loosened then, a knot he had carried silently through 3 long winters, and for the first time since Marianne's death, he smiled. Not a large smile, not even a happy one, just the quiet smile of a man who suddenly realizes that some promises continue long after the people who made them are gone. The watch was returned to the woman the next morning. She held it carefully in both hands and listened to its steady ticking. Tears gathered silently in her eyes. For a moment, she pressed the watch against her chest, like someone holding a hand they had almost forgotten. She did not explain why. She did not need to. Arthur understood. Some stories are not meant to be told. Some promises are not meant to be explained. They are meant to be kept. That evening, Arthur sat in his workshop, surrounded by the ticking of 1,000 clocks, and he felt less alone than he had in 3 winters. The snow continued to fall outside. The street lamps glowed their quiet gold. The grandfather clock by the door marked each second with its slow, steady pulse. "Wait for me," he whispered softly into the warm lamplight. "I will come back." And somewhere, he imagined, Marianne was listening. Somewhere, a watch was ticking. Somewhere, 2 people separated by time were still keeping faith with one another. And somewhere beyond the reach of winter, love, patient, quiet love, continued on. The clockmaker closed his eyes. The symphony of seconds slowed around him. And softly, gently, as the snow fell and the night deepened, he let himself drift toward sleep. And now, in that same workshop, the same golden light still glows against the frosted windows. The same snow falls gently onto the quiet cobblestone street. Somewhere in the corner, the grandfather clock continues its deep, steady rhythm. The pocket watch has been returned. The promise has been honored. The world outside the workshop is cold and dark and still, but inside, it is warm, and it is safe, and there is nothing left to fix. The clocks continue their soft conversation with the night, tick after tick, breath after breath, slow, steady, unhurried. as though time itself has decided, just for this evening, to be gentle with you. Feel the warmth around you now, like lamplight on a wooden bench. Feel your breathing slow, matching itself to the rhythm of something ancient and patient. Your thoughts no longer need to hold themselves awake. Your body can grow heavy now, warm and loose beneath the blankets, while the quiet ticking carries every unfinished thought softly into the dark. Outside, snow gathers silently along the empty street. Inside, the lamps still glow gold against the windows. And somewhere nearby, a faithful old clock continues keeping time for sleeping hearts. You have been part of something beautiful tonight, and now you can sleep. Good night. Sleep deeply. Sleep well.